At EA, when I was making Dead Space, they're like, hey, now that we see how good it is, we're gonna give you some extra money to make a scare system. If they aren't scared in like 10 minutes, then we'll have something come out and scare them. And I'm like, that is the exact opposite of what I want.
That is Glen Schofield, best known for directing the 2008 sci-fi horror Dead Space. Ahead of the release of the Callisto Protocol, the first game from his new studio Striking Distance, we sat down with Glen to talk about his horror influences and how he hopes his new game will get inside the head of even the most seasoned horror fan. From its very first trailer, the Callisto Protocol drew understandable comparisons to Dead Space. Released back in 2008, Dead Space drew acclaim for its immersive sci-fi atmosphere and its unrestrained graphic violence. In the years following its launch, Dead Space has proven to be a big influence on the survival horror genre and, it has to be said, on the Callisto Protocol itself. But despite the unfortunate timing of EA's own Dead Space remake launching in a few months' time, Glen insists he wasn't out to compete with his previous title.
I wasn't looking to outdo Dead Space. I didn't set out to make it all more brutal and more this and more that. It was just like, I'm gonna make something different. And so there's more story. The combat has evolved quite a bit. It wasn't a matter of like, make something scarier or this or that. It's just make something different than Dead Space to give fans something that I hope that they wanted. It feels like since Dead Space came out, like the horror genre has grown. I hadn't really seen a great sci-fi horror game in a long time.
Hold it down! I'm trying!
Whether or not Striking Distance has been successful in distancing the two games is up for debate. Both games feature a relatively ill-equipped protagonist exploring a dark and dangerous sci-fi facility filled with mutated humans. To most people's eyes, the differences are going to be pretty subtle. However, it seems this is as much a reflection of Glen's personal horror tastes and real-life influences as it is a director sticking with an established formula.
I'm first a sci-fi guy, and then I started getting into horror and sci-fi horror. I can remember Pinhead and Clive Barker's stuff, John Carpenter's The Thing, of course, Halloween, and I've started getting into foreign stuff over the years, Argento in Italy to Miike in Japan. In the US, it's getting more brutal with people like Rob Zombie getting into it. Even ones that are more subtle, like Life, which is a great sci-fi horror, and even A Quiet Place. I like monsters that come from humans. Even the weird ones in ours, you'll see them, they have human teeth, or they'll have a spine or something. And that's because, to me, the most brutal thing you can come across is a human, like Jeffrey Dahmer or Ed Gein or any of these guys, just crazy. So take someone like Dahmer and you're like, that is not a normal human. Their brutality is just beyond what you can think about. I always want that sort of, that in the back of your head is like, is this guy as intelligent as me? Like, that's a scary monster.
Though Glen references real-life serial killers, it's clear that the monsters found in Dead Space and the Callisto Protocol are drawn from the long canon of grisly creations found in body horror. Body horror is a subgenre of horror obsessed with deforming and defiling the body in the most graphic and gratuitous ways possible. Think of Seth Brundle's hideous transformation in The Fly, French New Extreme Cinema films like Martyrs, or even traditional zombie films, which revel in showing you the rotting, decaying flesh of their monsters in visceral detail. In his book about the horror genre, Danse Macabre, Stephen King memorably broke horror fiction down to 3 levels: terror, horror, and gross out. According to King, terror is the finest emotion in horror, playing on the viewer's imagination, and horror relies on a combination of both imagination and imagery that invites a physical reaction by showing something which is physically wrong, like a giant spider. But gross out horror, horror that plays on feelings of revulsion and disgust, aims to make the audience or the player physically react or recoil to what they see by being as revolting and transgressive as possible. In some ways, body horror is this gross out part of the genre operating on its most base psychological level, and it can be brutally effective, so much so that Stephen King claims to only resort to it when terror and horror fail him, stating, "If I find I cannot terrify them, I will try to horrify, and if I cannot horrify, I'll go for the gross out. I'm not proud." One thing that's pretty clear from the Callisto Protocol is that Glen Schofield is not proud either. It is absolute horror maximalism. from the shrieking score that erupts during jump scares to the over-the-top death animations visited upon poor Jacob that will no doubt be cut into YouTube compilations for anyone wishing to satisfy that gross-out itch. However, another thing that's pretty clear is that Glen is a die-hard horror fan, and he knows what fans will be expecting from a game like the Callisto Protocol. As such, Striking Distance has gone to some lengths to ensure the game remains surprising and scary, even for people who know their horror games inside out, so to speak. One of the ways they hope to achieve this is through something they call horror engineering, a philosophy where they hope to combine elements of brutality, atmosphere, tension, helplessness, and humanity into every encounter.
There's a lot of thought behind it. We make sure that those 5 big tent poles are within the game and that we're using them. But the engineering is also because I believe that the best video games setups and things like that are at the intersection of art, design, and technology. When the 3 of them kind of hit, you know, like in a monster or a scare, right? That's when video games are at their best.
Through this horror engineering, Striking Distance hopes to ensure that Callisto remains unpredictable to every player, resisting the well-worn patterns and rhythms of survival horror that many of us are so familiar with. In essence, Glen Schofield hopes that, as a die-hard horror fan, he's in the perfect position to pull the rug out from other horror veterans.
When it comes to putting setups together, there are no rules. The setup itself may be that horror engineering, but where it happens and how it happens is from the gut, right? You know, I had someone say at EA when I was making Dead Space, they're like, hey, now that we see how good it is, we're gonna give you some extra money to make a scare system. If they aren't scared in like 10 minutes and we'll have something come out and scare them, I'm like, that is the exact opposite of what I want. I wanna scare you and then you go, whew. All right, and then I give you 5 minutes and we scare you again. Or I'm gonna scare you and 2 seconds later I'm gonna get you again because you'll never think that we'll do it. And then once you know we're gonna mess with you, now we got you. And that's why we do things like at the beginning of the game, we might scare you at a door or do something in an elevator, right? Because then you're always gonna be like, you know, hyper vigilant.
If you're not a horror fan, being confronted with a game where so much effort is being put into creating as scary an experience as possible might sound like a total nightmare. But as we've covered previously on MindGames, some studies suggest that experiencing recreational fear through horror media has benefits for developing your skills in emotional regulation. If you're like me and you love horror, that theoretical benefit you get from horror might sound familiar.
Oh, I think it's like a roller coaster ride. I think they like that adrenaline rush, you know, that anticipation, and then like, you know it's coming, but you don't know exactly when you're gonna hit that crest. You don't really go through scares for 10 hours in life, right? And this is just a chance to tap into a much different set of emotions. When I'm about to watch a movie, a scary movie, there's some days I'm like, no, not tonight, action. You know, because sometimes horror, you got to get into it, right? I think that's the way with a game like that. And with this one, we are really trying to immerse you in it. Like we spent so much time, energy, money on that main character and the other characters so that the eyes are right, so the teeth are right, so there's nothing to take you out of the situation you're in. That's why we spend so much time on the backgrounds to try and just make you feel like you're there.
If you're a horror veteran, the Callisto Protocol may prove to be a useful experience, in that it's a game aiming to undermine the expectations of those very players who think they know exactly what awaits them. It's a love letter to the genre and to those players who enjoy being scared. Just make sure you've got a strong stomach. What scares you?
Roller coasters. And let me tell you, sometimes a jump scare will get me when I'm not expecting it. You know, I love it when camera's over there, and I'm like, okay, where are they gonna show it? And then it gets me from someplace else. That kind of scares me.